Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Jason Isbell and the 400 Unit, Reunions. In 2017, I made what a lot of folks would argue is a pretty charged statement that country music was on the forefront of the broader culture war across the United States, and if there was an album that felt like a broadside across the established paradigm, it was the Nashville Sound by Jason Isbell and his band the 400 Unit. And looking back on that time, I can see why I made that statement. I had loved the album. Hell, it had sold well, it stuck around in conversation, even penetrating outside the alternative and indie country spaces. It was making waves, one of the most potent singer-songwriters of the past couple decades on a hot streak of incredibly moving and explosive material, some of the best albums of their respective years, and he was not holding back. But looking back, yeah, the statement was probably a bit hyperbolic, maybe overly optimistic in assuming that album had that much divisive power. Or was I? If anything, it seemed like Jason Isbell's public profile has grown with every passing year in fits and spurts. Hell, with that 30 to 50 feral hogs meme, he saw exposure online in a way that country music never gets. But it's also increasingly hard to argue that his left-leaning political stance has started to split more audiences. And it's kind of fascinating to see how this has impacted some conservative-leaning critics, both within country and in the indie scene, who have not reacted the best to his complicated and messy disavowal of his former friend, songwriter, unrepentant asshole, and now accused sexual abuser, Ryan Adams. Now, these critics were champions of Isbell before, and even now they struggle to deny how great of a songwriter he really is. But you read any of the reviews and you start seeing any possible nitpick blown out to some frankly absurd proportions, or see any political subtext amplified for good or ill. And it's not strictly a condemnation of that in the review, given that all criticism is based on subjective experience, but when it becomes a little hyperbolic or willfully disingenuous, I will start asking questions. And on a different scale, it's true for the left as well, who have amplified a lot of Isbell's politics really beyond a lot of the text that's on display. Hell, take my initial statement, and in retrospect, again, it feels hyperbolic based off my experience with the album, especially given the more directly charged projects released in the past couple of years. Even Jason Isbell's wife, Amanda Shires of the Highwomen, they would make transgressive statements as potent as his, if not more so. And that led for me to be very curious about where his newest album, Reunions, would be going. Once again, teaming up with Dave Cobb on production, but reportedly a more lush and varied experience than his previously pretty bare albums, even more than the ruckus moments on the Nashville Sound. It sounded like it'd be a little more experimental, and given interviews have suggested a rather tempestuous recording session that tested his marriage to the very limits, I was worried what could have come out of this, so okay, what do we get on Reunions? So this is a tough album to evaluate on a number of levels, partially because there's more going on in comparison with something more than free in the Nashville Sound, partially because it's stuck in the unenviable position of being compared to both of those albums, partially because it's a less immediate experience as a whole, but also partially because its mood and character is much more unstable and unsettled in comparison with previous albums. And you might think that sounds kind of crazy compared to the Nashville Sound and how ruckus and raw that could be, but the core of that album was always intact, and there is a stability in making the choice to be more vulnerable. Reunions, on the other hand, it might not have the same barn burners of the last album, but it's more unsettled at the core. Jason Isbell has confessed this was a hard album to make, and if you can't hear it in the sound because of veteran proficiency and Dave Cobb smoothing over the rough edges, it absolutely comes through in a lot of the writing and delivery. And yeah, it gets political in spots, but in a way that's not as obvious as White Man's World or Hope the High Road, and yet it feels more confrontational on a bone-deep level. This isn't playing to the talking points, this is attempting to hit at the human spirit and the values of his target audience, and yeah, we gotta talk about that. Take the opening song, What I've Done to Help, which might seem to be more autobiographical and finding comfort in family, but that message starts to change when you realize midway through that temptation to pull the ladder up from behind you, all the more easy with privilege and in a world that might be on fire. So the question and sense of guilt cuts even deeper. That's the individual journey versus the collective good. That's pretty fundamental here. And Be Afraid is even more loaded, which seems to be an explicit call out to people in the middle vacillating on political choices for fear of taking a stand, where Isbell says to embrace that fear and do the right thing anyway, if not for yourself but for your future offspring, as he's not just gonna shut up and sing here. Now, I have seen the criticism from some conservatives and folks in the middle that this is kind of self-righteous and convinced of the moral truth of his cause, and on some level, people don't like the feeling of being blamed or compelled to act. They don't like the guilt trip. But my response to that is, A, the song is abstract enough to not even take much of a hard stance except for courage. B, if you're feeling a twinge of guilt, that's on your emotional response to the art, might be worth examining. And C, if you've made the choice to surrender your voice against systemic injustice and rising authoritarianism, hell, Kendrick Lamar said on Damn 3 years ago, that's what the majority of well-meaning people will do if it's easy. Hell, that's on you as well. I mean, we'd like to think that empathy isn't all that political these days, right? And yet, if you're looking at the thematic core of this project, any of this being easy, it's not a part of it. And simply in how Jason Isbell tells stories of family makes that brutally clear. One of the lead singles, Dreamsicle, will prime the pump, capturing the initial innocence and hopes of a child in the face of a broken family that has let him down despite everything, and you can tell he is outright terrified of failing in the same way. Most because he knows he's vulnerable to that failure. That expands off the groundwork of vulnerability he laid on the Nashville Sound, but cuts deeper on songs like Only Children, telling the story of a wild young friendship where said friend dies of shared vices, and you know the subtext is that Jason Isbell could have wound up exactly the same. Hell, there's some interpretations the song is him talking to himself, and that same undercurrent of recklessness slides into It Gets Easier, which is very frank with Isbell's alcoholism and how easy it would be to relapse and succumb. But if this was just him and focused on his own demons, that'd be one thing. But in the way he highlights the failure of parents, he'll also look at the natural strain of relationships, the tension and fragile nature of trust between partners and running with their eyes closed, where logic and reason might not suffice. Then you get the couple that's split apart and overseas, where dreams are getting chased halfway around the world as he tries to hold the house together in a crumbling world, and the messy emotions that will come out of that. A lot of those emotions not good. Or how he struggles to comfort his wife as she deals with the death of a close friend on St. Peter's Autograph. Give her some vestige of hope that this person's in a better place. And a song like River, likely a larger metaphor for the passage of time, in facing the weight of sins and vices and the alienation from the world and the people he loves, at some point the solitary man cannot stand alone and must accept the tide, with the hope of preserving a little bit more along the way. Hell, that's why the final song, Letting You Go, is directed at his daughter and finding the ability to let her live her life and find that next level of trust. The album is in essence testing and questioning the value we place on our relationships. And hell, no wonder it sounds so fragile and tenuous when you're talking about family, especially when you yourself feel every incentive to maybe self-sabotage. It's the struggle to be better and the acknowledgement that we only can be better with, well, each other. And you know, I could go on pointing out the thematic richness reinforced by all the little details that Isbell includes and to paint his stories, just the rich sense of drama, and he's still a fantastic writer in painting those scenes. But if the music isn't there and the same, it's not gonna hit, especially given that Jason Isbell is working with more diverse and expansive arrangements this time around in comparison with his last 3 albums. And this might be one of the reasons why the more political moments don't quite hit as strongly as they could. Because from a production and compositional standpoint, I would argue What I've Done to Help and Be Afraid, they are the 2 weakest moments on the album, the former just running out way too long and feeling oddly underwritten, and the latter with a lot of flattened smolder that kind of gets swallowed up in its own production effects by the end there. Now, this is definitely a point where you could tell that Dave Cobb was experimenting a little to flesh out the soundscape beyond the more stately mix he's delivered before, and I'll say it, not all the experiments land. The oddly hooting guitar solo on St. Peter's Autograph, really any synth layering that slides in, a little bit too much reverb around some of the vocals and spots. Even if his bass mixing's gotten considerably better, these are distracting moments. Hell, this calls back to why the production was so spare on previous projects. When the writing is as good as it is, get the hell out of the way for it. But here's the thing. it's still Dave Cobb. The production quality is absolutely going to be there across an amazingly well-balanced and textured mix. And Jason Isbell leaning more into his desire to cut loose on the guitar for solos, it's welcome in adding some of that ragged feel that fits the tone of the album. I love the multitude of electric guitar timbres that flesh out the mix, carrying a lot of texture and melodic tone, but also leaning a little bit cooler than how warm they have sounded in the past. And I still think Dave Cobb is one of the best fiddle producers working and giving Amanda Shires everything she needs, both on fiddle and in some of the backing vocals. Now, what I found was a real treat, though, came in the compositions. Because while songs like Letting You Go and River felt a little more conventional, that parallel in the chord structures to Steven Wilson that I started hearing on Something More Than Free, it's absolutely back on cuts like Overseas or Only Children, and it gives the album such a distinctive melodic character. Hell, Running With Our Eyes Closed goes for some bassy, slow burn southern swagger, and it's never been a lane I thought Isbell would ever take in these days, but even with some of the synth touches, the song sounds fantastic. It's one of the highlights. And yet as a whole, alright, look, for me, Jason Isbell's a very easy sell on the songwriting alone, and on a thematic level, I would argue this holds together as much, if not more so, compared to some of his best. Maybe even more than Something More Than Free. But on a sonic level, I'd also say it's got the most moments that don't quite land, and the shuddering bleakness of so much of it in between the lines makes it a tougher, more harrowing listen, and I don't think it's got the towering standouts of Cumberland Gap or If We Were Vampires. Now, granted, that's an opinion that'll likely evolve as the year progresses. Jason Isbell always grows on me, but it does mean I don't quite adore this in the same way I did the past two albums, which means it's a very light 9 out of 10 and highly recommended, but it's got a much steeper hill to climb to be among my favorites of 2020. We'll have to see. But otherwise, you know what? I can hear this album being challenging for some audiences, really a lot of audiences, but man, still worth it all the same. Take the time. It's quite the reunion to come back to. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Bit of a loaded project, that's what the comments are for, happy to hear from you. But I've also got the poll up there. I'm curious where you guys fall on this, and keep in mind the polls might be going away in the future, so better make use of them while you can. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than grateful to hear about it. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling for solo reviews or On the Pulse, link to my Patreon is right over there. I understand at this time if it's too much or you don't have the time or opportunities to get involved, we're all in there, tough times. But hey, if you want to, opportunities right over there. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.